Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the USS Macon, 1935. Close your eyes and let your mind travel back to a time when the sky was not the domain of roaring jets, but of silent, silver giants. Imagine the world in the early 1930s. It is an era of transition, where the echoes of the Great War still linger in the architecture of our machines, and the future feels as vast and as unmapped as the Pacific Ocean itself. We are standing on the edge of a dream made of duralumin and silk, floating on a sea of invisible gas. The air is cool, carrying the scent of salt and damp earth, as we find ourselves on the grounds of the Naval Air Station in Sunnyvale, California. It is the morning of February 12th, 1935. The sun has not yet fully claimed the horizon, and a soft, pearly mist clings to the landscape, softening the edges of the massive hangars that rise like cathedrals from the flat valley floor. In the stillness of this hour, there is a sense of profound weight and even more profound lightness. Before us stands Hangar 1, a structure so immense it seems to generate its own weather. Its silver-gray curves disappear into the low clouds, a monument to human ambition. Inside this hollow mountain lies the queen of the California sky, the USS Macon. She is 785 feet of shimmering elegance, a rigid airship so large that 3 modern 747 airplanes could fit within her length with room to spare. As the hangar doors groan open, the sound echoing like a low, metallic moan across the airfield, the Macon is revealed. Her skin is a taut, painted fabric, shimmering with a metallic luster that catches the first pale rays of dawn. It is not a solid shell, but a delicate envelope stretched over a complex skeleton of lightweight alloy. If you could reach out and touch her, you would feel the slight vibration of the air moving around her, a living pulse within a machine. Inside that vast body, 12 massive cells of gelatin latex fabric hold 6.5 million cubic feet of helium. This gas, lighter than the very air we breathe, strains upward, tugging at the mooring lines with a gentle, persistent force that feels like the breathing of a great leviathan. Listen to the sounds of the morning. There is the rhythmic clink of metal against metal as the ground crew, hundreds of men in dark wool coats, move with practiced precision. You can hear the low murmur of their voices, hushed by the sheer scale of the ship they serve. The commander, Herbert Victor Wiley, stands in the control car, a small, glass-enclosed cabin that hangs beneath the forward section of the hull like a jewel. The interior of the Macon is a hidden world, a labyrinth of narrow catwalks only 12 inches wide, threading through a forest of gleaming girders and wire stays. It smells of machine oil, fresh paint, and the faint, sweet scent of the rubberized fabric. There are sleeping berths for 83 men, a galley where the smell of coffee is beginning to rise, and even a small smoking room. But most miraculous of all is the hangar bay hidden within her belly. There, suspended from a trapeze, are the sparrowhawks, 5 small biplanes with bright blue wings, tucked away like chicks beneath a mother bird. They are the sting of this silver giant, ready to be launched into the void and caught again in midair, a feat of aeronautical magic that seems to defy the very laws of gravity. The order is given. The engines begin to cough and then settle into a deep, synchronized thrum. There are 8 of them, powerful German-built Maybach engines housed within the hull itself, their long drive shafts extending to propellers that can pivot up, down, and backward. The vibration travels through the duralumin frame, a low-frequency hum that you feel in your chest more than you hear in your ears. The mooring mast, a great steel tower that has held the Macon captive, begins to release its grip. Slowly, with a grace that contradicts her massive size, the airship begins to back away from the mast. The ground crew let go of the handling lines, and for a moment, the ship hangs in perfect equilibrium, a silver ghost suspended between the earth and the heavens. Then, with a gentle surge of power, she begins to rise. The valley floor falls away, the orange groves of Santa Clara becoming a patchwork quilt of dark green and gold. The mist below breaks apart, revealing the winding silver ribbon of the coastline. The Macon turns her nose toward the sea, her great shadow gliding over the waves like a silent predator of the clouds. As we float southward along the rugged California coast, the beauty of the scene is hypnotic. The Pacific Ocean is a deep, bruised purple, flecked with the white foam of breaking waves against the dark cliffs of Big Sur. Above, the sky is a pale, infinite blue, and the Macon seems to belong here, a natural extension of the clouds. The wind whistles softly against the fabric of the hull, a high-pitched sigh that mingles with the steady drone of the propellers. On the observation platforms at the very tail of the ship, a crewman might look back and see the white wake of the airship's passage in the air, a disturbance of light and shadow. Everything feels steady, secure, and permanent. The crew goes about their routines, checking the tension of the wires, monitoring the temperature of the helium, and preparing the small biplanes for their scouting maneuvers. They are the elite, the pioneers of a new age of naval power. They do not know that the atmosphere is beginning to change. They do not feel the subtle shift in the barometric pressure or see the dark, heavy line of a storm front gathering far to the south, near Point Sur. For now, there is only the majesty of the flight, the silver ship reflecting the sunlight, and the endless, beautiful horizon beckoning them forward into the afternoon. Beneath the vast, shimmering silver skin of the Macon, the world transforms into a cathedral of duralumin. As we move away from the observation windows and into the heart of the great airship, the scale of this engineering marvel becomes almost overwhelming. The interior is not solid, but a sprawling, hollow labyrinth of silver-gray girders and delicate cross-bracings that stretch upward into a darkness, filled with the soft, rustling sighs of the massive helium cells. These titanic bags, crafted from layers of rubberized fabric and gold beater's skin, hang above us like the lungs of a sleeping giant, holding millions of cubic feet of gas that keep this 785-foot structure afloat. There is a specific scent here, a mixture of high-octane gasoline, ozone, and the faint, sweet metallic tang of the helium. Your footsteps on the narrow, cork-lined walkways are muffled, swallowed by the immense volume of the hull. Every few seconds, you feel a gentle, slow-motion sway, a reminder that you are not on solid ground, but suspended thousands of feet above the bruising purple of the Pacific. The air is cool and thin, carrying the rhythmic, distant vibration of the 8 German-built Maybach engines that power our journey through the clouds. Deep within the belly of the ship, we come upon the most revolutionary chamber of all, the internal hangar. It is a space roughly 75 feet long and 60 feet wide, carved directly into the lower frame of the airship. Here, suspended from overhead rails like toys in a nursery, are the Curtiss Sparrowhawk biplanes. These are the parasite fighters, small and nimble with wings painted in vibrant navy blue and silver. Their presence inside a flying vessel feels impossible, yet there they hang, 5 of them, their propellers still and their cockpits empty, waiting for the call to scout the horizon. The hangar deck is a hive of quiet, focused activity. You can see the gleam of the duralumin framework reflecting off the polished fuselages of the planes. The mechanics move with practiced grace, their hands sliding over the struts and wires, checking every bolt and tension wire. There is no roar of a traditional aircraft carrier deck here, only the muffled clinking of tools and the low hum of the airship's own heart. Each biplane is equipped with a peculiar device atop its upper wing, a sturdy metal hook designed for a high-altitude dance that defies the laws of traditional aviation. Tucked away in nacelles along the sides of the hull are the 8 Maybach 12-cylinder engines, the heavy, mechanical pulse of the Macon. These engines are masterpieces of 1930s engineering, each generating 560 horsepower. Unlike the engines of a common airplane, these are mounted internally to protect them from the salt spray and the biting winds of the open ocean. As you stand near one of the engine stations, the sound is a deep, resonant thrum that you feel in your marrow more than you hear in your ears. It is a rhythmic, hypnotic drumming, a steady sequence of combustion that propels the massive dirigible at nearly 80 miles per hour. The engineers stationed here monitor the gauges with intense focus, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of amber dials. They adjust the cooling shutters and check the oil pressures, ensuring the liquid-cooled blocks stay within their narrow temperature margins. One of the most unique features of these power plants is their ability to swivel. With a slow, mechanical groan, the external propellers can be turned to point downward or even in reverse, allowing the Macon to hover or back away from a mooring mast with the delicacy of a dragonfly. The heat radiating from the engine blocks provides a localized warmth, a brief respite from the biting cold that seeps through the airship's outer fabric. Suddenly, the quiet routine of the hangar is broken by the command to launch. The floor of the hangar begins to move as the massive, T-shaped hatch in the airship's belly slides open. Immediately, a rush of frigid, high-altitude wind roars into the chamber, bringing with it the scent of salt and the dizzying sight of the ocean floor thousands of feet below. One of the Sparrowhawks is maneuvered onto the trapeze, a robust metal framework that resembles a playground swing, but is built of high-strength steel. The pilot, dressed in a thick leather flight suit and sheepskin-lined boots, climbs into the narrow cockpit. He settles into the seat, which smells of aged leather and cold iron, and begins his pre-flight checks. There is no runway here, no room for error. An electric ignition line is lowered from the ceiling of the hangar, and with a sharp, coughing sputter, the biplane's radial engine roars to life. The sound is a sharp, frantic contrast to the deep, steady thrum of the Maybachs. The biplane vibrates with a violent energy, its propeller a blur of silver against the blue void visible through the open hatch. The pilot gives a steady nod, his eyes fixed on the horizon, as the trapeze begins its slow, mechanical descent into the slipstream. As the trapeze lowers the Sparrowhawk out of the belly of the Macon, the little biplane is suddenly buffeted by the immense force of the wind. It hangs there for a moment, suspended between the giant silver hull and the empty sky. Then, with a pull of a release lever, the hook detaches, and the plane falls away, diving into the clouds before its wings catch the air, and it levels out into a graceful arc. From the observation gallery, we watch as it becomes a mere speck against the vastness of the Pacific. But the true magic happens during the recovery. Hours later, the Scout return, buzzing toward the underside of the mother ship. The pilot must match the speed of the Macon perfectly, flying at approximately 70 knots in the turbulent air beneath the hull. It is a grueling test of nerves and precision. He inches closer and closer, the skyhook on his top wing reaching for the crossbar of the dangling trapeze. The wind buffets his small craft, tossing it like a leaf, but he maintains his steady course. With a metallic clang that echoes through the interior of the airship, the hook latches. The biplane is suddenly caught, its engine cut, and it hangs silently once more. The winch groans as it pulls the plane back up into the safety of the warm hangar, the T-shaped doors closing to seal out the wild, whistling winds of the 1935 sky. The air surrounding the Macon was no longer a partner in flight, but a heavy, antagonistic force. As the ship approached the rugged cliffs of Point Sur on that afternoon of February 12, 1935, the sky had surrendered its afternoon gold to a suffocating, bruised purple. Below, the Pacific Ocean was a churning cauldron of slate-gray waves, crested with aggressive white foam that seemed to reach up for the airship's silver belly. Inside the hull, the atmosphere was one of strained vigilance. The immense duralumin skeleton, a web of thousands of interconnected girders, hummed with a low, vibrating frequency. It was the sound of a giant under pressure. The crew, moving along the narrow catwalks that stretched like spider silk through the dark interior, could feel the slight, rhythmic swaying of the ship, a motion that was becoming less of a cradle-like rock and more of a sharp, unpredictable shudder. The smell of the air had changed, too. The faint, metallic scent of the girders and the oily aroma of the 8 Maybach engines were now being overtaken by the damp, salt-laden chill of the storm clouds pressing against the outer fabric skin. Suddenly, the ship encountered a violent shear of wind, an invisible hammer falling from the heights of the coastal mountains. It was a gust of such ferocity that the entire 785-foot structure seemed to groan in a deep, bass tone. At the rear of the ship, near the tail section known as frame 17.5, the stress was reaching its breaking point. This specific ring of derailment had been weakened in a previous flight over the mountains of Arizona, and though temporary patches had been applied, the metal was fatigued. As the wind slammed into the upper vertical fin, the pressure became unbearable. There was a sound that those nearby would never forget, not a roar, but a sharp, crystalline snap, like 1,000 dry branches breaking at once. It was the sound of structural derailment failing. The upper fin, a massive wall of fabric and metal, began to twist and buckle under the relentless torque of the gale. The metal girders did not just bend. They shattered, turning into jagged shards of silver that began to slice through the very soul of the ship. The failure was catastrophic and immediate. As the upper fin was torn from its moorings, it didn't just fall away into the gray abyss below. Instead, it pulled and twisted at the surrounding structure, dragging sections of the ring frame with it. These jagged remnants of the skeleton were thrust inward, deep into the delicate, rubberized fabric of the helium gas cells. Cells 4, 5, and 6, the massive bladders of gas that provided the lift for the tail, were suddenly and violently punctured. There was no loud explosion, only a horrific, ghostly hiss that could be heard even over the roar of the engines. The precious helium, the invisible breath that kept the Macon aloft, began to bleed out into the storm. It was a silent theft of buoyancy. The crew members stationed in the aft section watched in dim light as the huge, silver-gray bags began to go limp, wrinkling like the skin of an aging giant. The balance of the ship, once a marvel of engineering, was being undone in seconds. The tail, now heavy with the weight of dead metal and lacking the lift of its gas, began to sag toward the hungry ocean. In the control car, suspended beneath the forward part of the hull, the officers felt the change before they understood it. The floor beneath their feet began to tilt upward at a steep, alarming angle. The nose of the Macon was rising, pushed toward the heavens as the tail grew heavy and sank. Lieutenant Commander Herbert Wiley and his officers gripped the brass railings, their eyes darting to the altimeters and the inclinometers. The needles were dancing. To the men on the bridge, the ship felt sluggish, as if it were moving through thick syrup. There was a confusing barrage of reports coming from the internal telephone system, shouted words about falling debris and the smell of rushing air. They knew they were losing gas in the rear, but they didn't yet know that the upper fin was gone entirely. The darkness of the storm outside the windows made it impossible to see the devastation at the tail. All they knew was that the Macon was no longer responding to the elevators. She was behaving like a wounded animal, pitching and struggling as she was caught in a terminal climb, heading toward the dangerous threshold of her pressure height. As the ship tilted further, the sound of the wind screaming through the gaps where the fin had been created an eerie, flute-like whistle that echoed through the hollow caverns of the hull. It was a haunting melody for a dying giant. The crew on the catwalks found themselves clinging to the derailment ribs, their knuckles white against the cold metal, as the ship pitched nearly 20 degrees. Fuel and water ballast began to shift in their tanks, adding to the cacophony of sloshing liquids and groaning girders. Every man on board felt the sudden, terrifying realization that the sky, which had been their home for so many successful hours, had turned into a trap. The air was thin, the helium was vanishing, and the great silver ship was beginning its final, desperate dance with the elements. There was no panic yet, only a cold, mechanical focus, as the men waited for the next order from the bridge, unaware that they were now soaring toward an altitude that would seal their fate. The deck beneath the crew's boots began to slant at an alarming angle, a slow and heavy tilt that pulled at the very center of their gravity. Inside the control car, the air felt thick with the scent of damp wool and the sharp, metallic tang of stressed derailment. Commander Wiley's voice remained steady, a low anchor amidst the rising chaos, as he issued the order to lighten the load. There was no room for hesitation. In the narrow, echoing gangways that stretched like silver ribs through the length of the ship, sailors moved with a practiced, rhythmic urgency. Their hands, calloused and cold from the damp Pacific air, gripped the release levers for the fuel tanks. With a series of hollow, metallic thuds that vibrated through the skeletal frame, thousands of pounds of gasoline were surrendered to the clouds below. The heavy tanks fell away into the gray abyss, disappearing instantly into the thick fog that clung to the coast of Point Sur. Following the fuel, the water ballast was next. Great bags of treated water were ruptured or released, sending shimmering cascades into the void. This was the first stage of their agonizing struggle, a desperate attempt to counter the weight of the sinking tail and the relentless pull of the ocean hidden somewhere beneath the mist. As the 9,000 pounds of ballast and 7,000 pounds of fuel were jettisoned, the Macon responded with a sickening, upward lurch. Instead of leveling out, the wounded giant began to climb, its nose pointing toward the heavens while its tattered tail dragged behind like a broken wing. The sudden loss of weight, combined with the engines still churning at full power, propelled the airship higher and higher, far beyond the safety of its intended cruising altitude. The crew watched the altimeter needles sweep past 2,000 feet, then 2,500. They were approaching the critical threshold known as pressure height. At 2,800 feet, the atmosphere changed. The air inside the gas cells, expanding as the outside pressure dropped, pushed against the rubberized fabric with immense force. Then came the sound, a haunting, collective sigh that echoed through the entire ship. It was the sound of the automatic valves opening. Precious helium, the very lifeblood of the Macon, began to hiss out into the atmosphere. It was a ghostly, invisible evaporation, a sacrifice made by the ship's own safety systems to prevent the cells from bursting. But in this moment, every cubic foot of gas lost was a second of flight stolen from them. The ascent did not stop at the pressure height. Driven by the momentum of its own trauma, the Macon continued to soar, eventually reaching a peak of 4,850 feet. Up here, above the worst of the storm, the world was strangely quiet, a stark contrast to the violence of the wind shear that had claimed their fin. The sun, pale and distant, cast a cold light over the silver skin of the airship, highlighting the wrinkles and tears where the structure had failed. For a brief, suspended moment, it felt as though they might simply float away into the blue. But the math of the sky is unforgiving. With so much helium vented during the climb, the ship had lost its buoyancy. The peak of their ascent was merely the top of a long, invisible arc. As the lift failed, the giant began to settle back down. The descent was not a plunge, but a slow, agonizing slide. It would take 20 long minutes for the Macon to return to the sea, a span of time that felt like an eternity to the 83 men on board. The atmosphere inside the ship shifted from frantic activity to a somber, professional silence. They were no longer fighting to stay in the air. They were preparing for the water. To balance the ship's heavy tail, Commander Wiley ordered all hands not essential to the controls to move forward into the nose. The gangways, usually silent and solitary, filled with the steady rhythm of marching feet. Men moved in single file, their shadows long and flickering against the inner fabric of the hull. There was no panic, no shouting. They moved with the quiet discipline of the United States Navy, clutching their life jackets, new additions to their gear following the tragedy of the Akron 2 years prior. As they huddled in the bow, the smell of the ocean began to rise through the gaps in the floorboards, a salty, bracing reminder of the world they were about to enter. Outside the windows of the control car, the gray curtain of the fog rushed up to meet them. The visibility dropped to almost nothing, the whitecaps of the Pacific appearing only as ghostly flashes through the haze. The tail, still heavy and unresponsive, was the first part of the ship to enter the mist, dragging lower and lower as the nose remained defiant, pointed toward the clouds they had just left behind. The engines, those great Maybach motors that had carried them across the continent, were now reduced to a low, rhythmic throb. One by one, they were feathered or shut down as the proximity to the water became undeniable. The crew could feel the temperature drop, the humid breath of the sea entering the ship through the rents in its side. Every creak of the duralumin girders sounded like a moan, the ship itself mourning its slow descent. They were 10 miles out from the rugged cliffs of the California coast, a lonely stretch of water where the currents were cold and the depths were unforgiving. In the radio room, the tapping of the telegraph continued, sending out the final coordinates and the simple, devastating message that they were abandoning ship. The professionalism of the radio man, his fingers steady even as the floor tilted further, was a testament to the spirit of the crew. They were watching the end of an era, the slow sinking of a dream made of silver and silk, and yet they stood their posts until the very last moment. The water was no longer a distant threat. It was a dark, churning reality just feet below the dragging tail, waiting to swallow the greatest airship the world had ever known. Fading into a heavy, weighted silence, the engines finally surrendered to the gravity of the moment. The great silver whale was no longer a creature of the clouds. It had become a prisoner of the descending mist. For 20 long minutes, the crew lived in a suspended state of slow-motion catastrophe. Unlike the fiery, instantaneous end of other great airships, the descent of the Macon was a lingering affair, a gradual settling that felt more like a weary sigh than a crash. The ship drifted downward from an altitude of 4,850 feet, its nose tilted upward at a steep, unnatural angle as the tail, heavy and wounded, dragged through the damp February air. Inside the hull, the sound of the wind rushing past the fabric was replaced by the eerie, metallic groans of duralumin girders under immense stress. Men clung to the internal catwalks, their knuckles white as they gripped the cold metal, watching the dark surface of the Pacific Ocean rise to meet them. There was no panic, only a focused, quiet urgency. They had learned from the tragedies of the past, and every man on board knew that their survival depended on the next few minutes of coordination. The air inside the cabins grew thick with the smell of escaping helium. A faint, sweet scent that signaled the lifeblood of the ship was leaking into the gray sky. As the tail finally brushed the white caps of the waves, a shudder ran through the entire length of the 785-foot structure, a vibration that felt like a heartbeat slowing to a stop. When the impact finally came, it was not a violent explosion, but a series of wet, heavy thuds as the rear of the ship began to settle into the swells. The ocean, deep and restless off the coast of Point Sur, began to claim the Macon tail first. The massive internal framework, designed to be light and rigid in the sky, was never meant for the crushing embrace of the sea. It began to fold in on itself like an accordion, the metal snapping with the sound of distant pistol shots. In the hangar bay, the 4 Sparrowhawk biplanes, those tiny guardians of the sky, remained perched on their trapezes as the water swirled around their landing gear. The transition from air to water was hauntingly quiet. The crew moved with a discipline born of the Navy, reaching for the newly issued inflatable life vests that had been added to their gear after the loss of the Akron 2 years prior. These bright yellow vests, smelling of fresh rubber and talcum powder, would become the thin line between life and the lightless depths of the Pacific. As the lower decks began to flood, the men stepped out into the dark, the water surprisingly warm against their skin despite the winter season. They worked in pairs, launching rubber life rafts into the churning water, the yellow fabric of the rafts standing out in sharp contrast against the ink-black waves and the gray, drizzling rain that had begun to fall from the heavy clouds above. The evacuation was nearly perfect, an orderly exodus from a sinking palace of the air. 81 men successfully moved from the crumbling skeleton of the airship into the safety of the rafts, bobbing like corks in the shadow of the dying giant. However, the shadows held two quiet tragedies that night. Radioman First Class Ernest Edwin Daly, perhaps overwhelmed by the sight of the water rushing toward the ship, made a fateful decision. He leapt from the structure while it was still far too high above the surface, his body disappearing into the dark mist long before the ship reached the safety of the waves. He was gone before the first raft even touched the water. Nearby, mess attendant First Class Florentino Edquiba had reached the safety of the ocean, but the pull of his personal belongings drew him back toward the sinking wreckage. He swam toward a section of the hull that was already being swallowed by the Pacific, hoping to retrieve his things, but the heavy, waterlogged fabric and the twisted duralumin girders created a labyrinth from which there was no escape. He was pulled down into the depths as the midsection of the ship gave way. These two losses were a somber reminder that even in a controlled descent, the sea is a merciless mistress. The remaining survivors clung to the ropes of their rafts, their eyes fixed on the massive silver hull that was now broken in two, the nose still pointing toward the stars, as if trying one last time to find its way back into the heavens. Waiting in the dark water was a test of patience and nerves. The survivors floated in a cluster of yellow rafts, the vastness of the ocean making them feel infinitesimally small. The sound of the waves lapping against the rubber was the only constant, punctuated by the occasional hiss of air escaping the remaining helium cells of the Macon. Above them, the sky was a leaden shroud, obscuring the moon and stars. They watched as the great ship slowly vanished, its silver skin shimmering one last time before slipping beneath the surface. To guide their rescuers, they lit gasoline flares, the orange flames casting long, flickering shadows across the water and reflecting in the salt-stung eyes of the men. The smell of burning fuel and salt spray hung heavy in the air. Far on the horizon, the first signs of hope appeared. The sharp, piercing beams of searchlights cutting through the drizzle. The cruisers Richmond, Cincinnati, and Concord were racing through the night, their powerful lights sweeping the ocean's surface in search of the lost crew. When the beams finally caught the yellow of the rafts, the light was so bright it felt like a physical weight, a blinding promise of safety. The men shielded their eyes, watching as the towering steel hulls of the Navy ships loomed out of the darkness. Their engines a deep, comforting thrum that vibrated through the water and into the very bones of the survivors. As the rescue ships pulled alongside, the sailors on deck threw down lines and ladders, their voices calling out into the night to guide the exhausted men. One by one, the 81 survivors were pulled from the cold Pacific and onto the steady, iron decks of the cruisers. They were wrapped in thick wool blankets and given hot coffee, the steam rising into the damp night air as they looked back at the spot where the Macon had been. There was nothing left but a few floating bits of debris and a slick of oil that calmed the surface of the waves. The giant was gone, resting now on the seafloor 1,500 feet below, where the pressure was immense and the darkness absolute. The biplanes, the engines, and the beautiful, complex skeleton of the ship would remain there, becoming a monument to an era of aviation that was coming to a quiet, watery end. The survivors sat in silence as the cruisers turned back toward the coast, the lights of the Point Sur lighthouse blinking in the distance like a steady, rhythmic pulse. The airship program had suffered a wound it would not recover from, but for the 81 men who watched the shoreline grow closer, The night was a testament to the slow, deliberate grace of a ship that refused to fall quickly, giving its crew one last chance to escape the cold Pacific embrace. The sun rose over the Pacific on the morning of February 13th, 1935, revealing an ocean that looked remarkably unchanged by the drama of the night before. The waves were a slate gray, rolling with a slow, heavy rhythm against the jagged cliffs of Point Sur. For the 81 survivors huddled on the decks of the rescue ships, the world felt fragile and strange. They were wrapped in thick, damp wool blankets that smelled of salt and industrial soap, their hands trembling as they gripped mugs of hot, black coffee. Back at Moffett Field, the great hangar stood like a hollow cathedral, its massive doors closed against the morning mist. The silence inside that cavernous space was deafening. There would be no low hum of engines returning from the sea, no shadow of the 785-foot giant sliding over the airfield. The air in the hangar felt thin and cold, as if the very spirit of the place had vanished beneath the waves with the ship. In the days that followed, the survivors were questioned in rooms that smelled of floor wax and old paper, their voices hushed as they recounted the final moments of the Silver Queen. The official Navy inquiry was a somber affair, held in quiet chambers where the ticking of wall clocks seemed to mark the end of an era. The admirals and architects, their uniforms crisp and their expressions unreadable, sifted through the wreckage of a dream. They spoke of structural failures and the treacherous wind shears of the California coast, but beneath the technical jargon was a growing realization. The age of the rigid airship, those majestic leviathans of the clouds, was drawing to a close. The tragedy of the Macon, coming so soon after the loss of her sister ship, the Akron, had sapped the nation's confidence in the great helium-filled giants. While the Navy would continue to use smaller, non-rigid blimps for coastal patrols, the vision of flying aircraft carriers was quietly set aside. The blueprints were rolled up and tucked away in dusty archives, and the sky began to belong to a new generation of aircraft, smaller, faster, and made of heavy metal rather than silk and duralumin. The Macon became a ghost, a memory of a future that never quite arrived, resting in a deep, pressurized silence that no human would disturb for over half a century. For 53 years, the Macon lay in total darkness, 1,500 feet below the surface. In that crushing depth, the water is a constant, bone-chilling temperature, and the light of the sun has never reached the sandy floor. It was a world of absolute stillness, where the only movement was the slow drift of marine snow falling from the upper reaches of the sea. Then, in 1988, the silence was broken. It began with a local fisherman named David Cainpa, whose nets snagged on something heavy and metallic off the coast of Big Sur. He brought a small piece of duralumin girder to the surface, a twisted fragment of silver-colored metal that still bore the marks of its manufacture. This small find reignited the search. In 1990, a team from the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute, led by Chris Gretsch and supported by the visionary David Packard, set out to find the resting place of the last great airship. They used a remotely operated vehicle, a robotic explorer equipped with powerful lights and cameras, to descend into the abyss. As the robot drifted down through the layers of blue and black water, the researchers watched their monitors in breathless anticipation, waiting for a sign of the Titan. The first images to flicker onto the screens were ghostly and surreal. Through the murk of the deep sea, the skeletal remains of the Macon emerged like the ruins of a submerged city. The duralumin frame, once the pride of American engineering, had been flattened by the immense pressure, spread out across two large debris fields on the ocean floor. The cameras moved slowly, revealing the 8 Maybach engines, their metal casings encrusted with delicate deep-sea anemones and a fine layer of silt. But the most haunting sight was the internal hangar. There, sitting upright on the sand, were the remains of the Sparrowhawk biplanes. Their tiny wings were gone, the fabric having long ago dissolved into the brine, but their aluminum skeletons remained remarkably intact. The sight of those small fighters, still huddled within the protective shadow of their mother ship, was a poignant reminder of the men on the flying trapeze. The robotic lights illuminated the iconic star insignia of the United States Navy, still visible on the metal, gleaming softly in the artificial glow. It was a time capsule of 1935, preserved in a liquid tomb where time seemed to have stood perfectly still. Today, the site of the wreck is a protected marine sanctuary, a place of quiet reverence where nature and history have become one. In 2010, it was added to the National Register of Historic Places, ensuring that the final resting place of the Macon would remain undisturbed by treasure hunters or salvagers. It is also a military grave site, honoring the two souls, Ernest Daly and Florentino Enquiba, who did not return from that final flight. The wreck has become a strange and beautiful artificial reef. Deep-sea corals have taken root on the girders, their orange and pink branches reaching out into the dark currents. Crabs and small fish dart through the open spaces of the cockpit, and the silt continues to settle, slowly burying the silver giant in the cradle of the earth. Researchers return every few years, sending down cameras to document the slow decay of the metal, watching as the ocean slowly reclaims the materials of the air. It is a peaceful end for a ship that was born of fire and wind, a monument to human ambition, resting in the deepest cradle of the world, far from the storms that once brought her down. As we leave the shores of California and the story of the USS Macon behind, imagine the quiet of those depths. The pressure is a gentle, heavy weight, and the darkness is a soft velvet curtain that hides the scars of the past. The silver girders and the tiny biplanes are safe now, tucked away in the heart of the Monterey Bay. The voices of the sailors have faded into the sound of the surf, and the great hangars of the world are filled with other dreams. You can let the images of the sky and the sea drift away, replaced by the warmth of your room and the steady rhythm of your own breath. The history is written, the mystery is solved, and the giants are at peace. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.